Africa.
Thanks, Laura. Before I get started, I am going to just pass around a quick handout showing kind of the evolution of Ebola caseloads during the Ebola outbreak. I know probably many of you are already familiar with kind of the timeline of the Ebola outbreak, but I'm going to go through a few of the key events that happened relating to FuseNet's food security monitoring, and I'll make reference to different points within the graphic, and there's going to be a fair amount of discussion about Ebola cases, so I just wanted to give people kind of a brief reminder of what the caseloads looked like during the Ebola outbreak. So, okay. Okay, so just kind of give you a brief idea of where I'll be going with this presentation. First, I'm not sure how familiar everyone is with FuseNet's work, so I'm just going to spend a few minutes going over what is FuseNet, what some of our goals are, as well as some of our analytical approaches and tools that we use for analyzing both current food security outcomes and projected food security outcomes. I'm then going to give a brief timeline of some of the food security monitoring that happened during the Ebola outbreak, both mainly focused on what FuseNet did, but also briefly discussing some other key organizations that were involved in food security monitoring at that time. I'll then discuss briefly some of the challenges and lessons learned that FuseNet took away from the Ebola outbreak. And then finally, FuseNet has recently opened offices in all 3 countries, and so I'm going to finish up the presentation discussing some next steps in food security monitoring in those 3 countries. So just as a bit of background on FuseNet, okay. FuseNet basically has 2 key purposes. The first purpose is to provide decision makers with early warning food security information to help decision makers make decisions on what type of humanitarian assistance is appropriate and how to allocate that humanitarian assistance across the world. The second key purpose of FuseNet is we also have a strong network development component to our work, and we work to provide both national early warning systems as well as regional organizations with some capacity building to enable them to provide better early warning and food security analyses. FuseNet is active in many countries throughout the world. We basically have 2 different types of FuseNet countries right now. We have presence countries, which are these dark purple countries shown on this map, and then we have remote monitoring countries. And so presence countries are countries where we do have a local office with technical staff that work with national organizations, NGOs, the UN, things of that sort, to collect food security information and monitor and report on it monthly. In remote monitoring countries, we do not have a local staff within the country or a local office, but instead we're monitoring the countries remotely from a neighboring country. And so, for example, with Senegal, our Malian office monitors information in Senegal by reaching out to partners and getting information from them. I would note, I'll go into a little more detail later, but Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea were all FuseNet remote monitoring countries at the point of the Ebola outbreak. And so we did not, at that time, have any local staff that were in those 3 countries, which, as I'll discuss later, provided a unique set of challenges in getting food security information at that time. I also just wanted to mention that FuseNet relies very heavily on partner information. FuseNet does not, in most cases, collect primary food security data, and so we don't go out and do national food security assessments. We're not doing smart surveys, things of that sort, with the exception of some unique cases where we have a particular food security concern. But instead, FuseNet primarily relies on data collection from other organizations that are active in those countries. And so here's just a brief list of some of the organizations that we work with throughout the FuseNet countries. I would note that within Washington, D.C., we work very closely with our science partners, USGS, NOAA, NASA, to gather a set of agroclimatology information to monitor droughts, rainfall, things of that sort. But then within both West Africa as well as within any given country, we also rely on another set of organizations. We work closely with national governments, regional bodies, the UN, NGOs, and other organizations, which are listed here. I also just wanted to briefly describe FuseNet's analytical approach, that FuseNet does food security analysis of both what's going on right now, as well as we provide early warning and projections for what will likely happen over a scenario period, which at the time of the Ebola outbreak was a 6-month period. We've recently extended it to 8 months to do early warning. And so this is basically a graphic showing FuseNet's scenario development approach that we use to project food security outcomes into the future. I'm not going to go too far into each individual step. It's kind of complicated, and I think that could be an entirely different presentation. But I just wanted to draw your attention to step 3, which is develop key assumptions. When we're projecting food security outcomes 6 months, 8 months into the future, that's quite challenging. Now no one can say with 100% certainty of what will likely happen into the future. And so FuseNet's approach is that we build a set of most likely assumptions of what we think would likely happen relating to rainfall with markets, conflict, things of that sort. And then using those assumptions, we're able to describe what some of the likely impacts on both household food and income sources, which will then enable a food security analyst to project household food security outcomes over the scenario period. Once we've described both current and projected food security outcomes, FuseNet uses the integrated phase classification system to classify food security outcomes. This is an internationally recognized classification system for food security that was developed through a group of organizations, including FuseNet, the UN, as well as several NGOs. And basically, it classifies food security outcomes from minimal IPC phase 1 food insecurity all the way up to phase 5, which is equivalent to famine. I wanted to draw your attention to phases 1 through 4 because these are the phases that we'll be talking about later in this presentation. And then finally, before I get too far into actually what happened during the Ebola outbreak, I just wanted to mention, as I said earlier, that all 3 of these countries were FuseNet remote monitoring countries at the point that the Ebola outbreak hit, which meant that we didn't have any local staff within those countries, and instead all 3 countries were being monitored through our regional office in Niamey. We did occasionally participate in in-country assessments, particularly harvest assessments and occasionally market assessments, but we did not travel to these countries on a frequent basis. Instead, we relied heavily on partner information, phone calls, emails, and partner reports, and our analyses were focused on food security anomalies. And so they were less detailed analyses than what you could do if you had a local presence and if you had someone within the country that were dedicated just on those countries. As a result, FuseNet did not do subnational mapping at the beginning of the Ebola outbreak. Instead, this is a bit blurry, but this is an example remote monitoring report. And you can see there's an outline of Liberia here. And so we basically did classifications based on the worst food security outcomes for a significant area of concern. And so as you can see here, this is green, which was phase 1 minimal food insecurity. So we were not anticipating that any area at the point this report was written was facing any elevated levels of food insecurity for any major area of concern. I would also note that prior to the Ebola outbreak, these countries aren't countries that are traditionally known for being food insecure. That, for example, I started with FUSNET in 2012, and from 2012 up until the Ebola outbreak, all three countries had been in minimal IPC phase 1 during that entire time period. That there were chronic food insecurity issues, but on the acute side, there hadn't been any major shocks at that time. Okay, so now that I've kind of gone over just kind of a background information on what is FUSNET, before we can really talk about lessons learned from the outbreak, I felt like we needed to just briefly go over what actually happened relating to food security monitoring in those three countries. I would note that at certain points, like I mentioned earlier, I'm going to make reference to the Ebola caseloads. It'll just kind of give you an idea of where we were with, there was a lot of panic at the point, particularly, I know you can recall, even in the U.S. in September, that there was a lot of panic going on about the Ebola outbreak, and that in West Africa is even worse. And so as we're talking about caseloads and where potential Ebola caseloads could go into the future, I will make reference to this table occasionally. I would also note before I go much further that this is a very different type of food security crisis compared to what FUSNET has traditionally worked on. That, for example, we have a lot of experience on if there's a drought, what does that mean for food security outcomes? Or if there's a conflict, what does that likely mean for food security outcomes? But this was really the first time that FUSNET had worked on a public health crisis, and there really wasn't any comparable situation that we were aware of to what was happening in West Africa. And so, for example, I know when the Ebola caseload started to increase and I was first working on this, that we did some research on what happened with food security outcomes during previous Ebola outbreaks. But really, there's nothing comparable to what happened in West Africa. Other Ebola outbreaks were maybe 1 village, 5 villages, things of that sort, maybe a couple hundred people maximum, but they were never to the level that was seen in West Africa. And so I think that led to a lot of uncertainty and a lot of questions about what food security outcomes would likely be. So just kind of as a reminder, the first cases of Ebola were reported in West Africa in early 2014, and WHO first reported cases in Guinea in March 23rd, 2014, with some confirmed cases, and then at that point there had been suspected cases in the other two countries, which were then confirmed in the coming weeks. At first, going between about March and June, FUSNET wasn't too concerned about the potential food security outcomes in these countries relating to Ebola. That the caseload, if you look at, for example, this graphic, the caseload at that time was quite low, and we kind of thought that the Ebola outbreak would likely follow what we've seen in other countries with Ebola. And so at that point, we had not had any major concerns, and we did not report on the first food security implications of Ebola until several months later in July 2014. At that point, we were mostly concerned about households who were directly impacted by the Ebola outbreak, so households who had lost family members, lost either due to illness or death, as well as in a couple of worst affected areas, for example, in Lofa County, some potential impacts on bushmeat sales, trade, things of that sort. That said, at this point, we did not think that the impacts on food security would be significant for a significant population, and so we were still projecting, despite the Ebola outbreak, that minimum IPC phase 1 would be likely in all three countries. This quickly changed moving forward into September. And so if you look at the caseloads in September, this is where we really are starting to see a very sharp increase in the number of Ebola cases throughout all three countries. At this point, it was starting to look like there could be an exponential increase in Ebola caseloads. This is where Ebola really started hitting the international media, and there was a lot of concern about what would be some of the potential economic and food security impacts. At this point in September, this is when FuseNet did our first special report on the Ebola outbreak. And we based our projections for food security outcomes at that time on current projections from WHO that there'd likely be about 20,000 cases of Ebola over the next 6 months. Since these were all remote monitoring countries for FuseNet and we did not have a significant amount of information, we helped coordinate an informal Ebola working group with partners that included the UN, included several USAID-funded projects, NGOs, to start the conversation on what could be the potential food security impacts of the Ebola outbreak and to start some data sharing and information sharing across organizations. At this point, WFP also began doing MVAM monitoring, which I don't know how familiar you are with their MVAM monitoring, but it's cell phone-based food security surveys where they're collecting just some very basic food security information. So generally, they collect food consumption score as well as RCSI, and sometimes they collect some additional information such as prices, labor incomes, things of that sort. And so they started doing that monitoring in late September. And then near the end of the month, the CDC published some new Ebola projections that were significantly higher based off of an potential exponential growth in Ebola cases. And so I don't know if any of you remember, but during this time period, the CDC published some numbers that hit the media of that in a worst-case scenario, there could be 1.4 million Ebola cases over the next 6 months. We talked with the authors of that study, as well as with several other organizations that were doing caseload projections at that time. And the CDC presented the 1.4 million, which was a worst-case scenario, but they also had done several other scenarios that were considered more likely scenarios that had significantly lower caseloads. And so based off of conversations with the CDC and some of these other organizations, we settled on a planning figure of about 200,000, 250,000 Ebola cases over the next 6 months, and then constructed our projected food security outcomes based off of that assumption. At that point, we knew that this was based off of an exponential increase in Ebola cases, which at the point of late September looked like it was possible that at that point there was a very sharp increase in Ebola cases. But we also presented this as not a most likely scenario, which we frequently do with our reports, because we did know that this would be a drastic increase in Ebola cases compared to what we are currently seeing. That said, if this were to occur, and there was, just to remind you, there was a large amount of panic in these 3 countries about the Ebola crisis, that airlines quit flying into these countries, and there were concerns that if these numbers were to actually occur, that they could have some drastic impacts, particularly on market functioning. And so we were concerned that these countries are highly dependent on rice imports, and a lot of the key rice importers are not local organizations, that they're international importers. And we were concerned that they might decide under a panic to pull out, and that this could lead to some severe issues with imported rice availability within the country, as well as there were also a lot of different quarantines being put up by local governments. And we were concerned that even if rice was to get into the country, that some of these quarantines could prevent trade flows and could cause some major issues with food availability on local markets. As a result, we felt that if some of these severe market impacts were to occur, as well as below average incomes, that this could lead to some very severe food security outcomes. And we projected at that time that there was the possibility of IPC Phase 3, crisis food security, as well as the potential for emergency IPC Phase 4. We also, at this time, because these were remote monitoring countries and we didn't have a local presence, we increased some of our presence within the countries by one. I moved out to Dakar to coordinate with regional partners that were based in Dakar and were working on some of the food security impacts of Ebola. And then we also hired local food security monitors that we weren't at that time, due to some various constraints with the Ebola crisis, we weren't able to get technical staff from outside those countries in, but we were able to hire some local food security monitors that were providing us with information on what was going on with markets, with household incomes, things like that. Okay. So moving forward 1 month to November, at this point, if you look back at the caseload figures, that this is where it started to become clear that the exponential growth in Ebola cases that were being projected by the CDC and other organizations did not seem like that was actually going to occur, and which is quite good, but that meant that we needed to update our assumptions about what would be the likely food security impacts, as it was clear that some of these market issues that we were anticipating would likely not actually occur. And so at this point, we updated our food security projections based off the lower estimates, but we're still anticipating many areas would face crisis IPC Phase 3, which means that at this point, households would be experiencing either food consumption gaps or be depleting their assets at an unsustainable level. We also, because we had a lot of concerns about some of the market implications and about what could be the impacts of some of the local quarantines that were being put in place, particularly in Sierra Leone, FuseNet began SMS-based trader surveys in Sierra Leone and Liberia to get information on market supplies, demand, things of that sort. And then based off of those surveys, we began publishing trader bulletins every month throughout the Ebola outbreak. Moving forward into December, at this point, due to interest from USAID, and due to some additional information that we were able to get from our food security monitors, as well as from our trader surveys and the NBAM surveys done by WFP, we began doing subnational maps, despite them being still remote monitoring countries. And then at this point, WFP and FAO published some initial reports projecting that due to the Ebola outbreak and its impact on agricultural labor and harvest, that crop production in all three countries would be slightly below average, meaning the household food stocks for the coming year would be slightly reduced. Moving forward 2 months into February, this is, if you look back onto the caseloads, at this point there were significantly fewer Ebola cases compared to previous months. And this was when FuseNet's technical staff from outside of those countries were finally able to get into the countries and participate in some assessments. We were involved in a joint market assessment with WFP, FAO, and local governments, looking at what some of the impacts were from the quarantines and from some other market closures and things like that from the Ebola outbreak. And then in West Africa, particularly in a lot of the Francophone countries, but it's now being spread to some of the Anglophone countries, they do cadre harmonisé food security analysis workshops, which are quite similar to, if you're familiar with IPC workshops in other parts of the world. It's basically consensus-based food security workshop where a group of organizations come together, including the UN, FuseNet, NGO partners, to look at all available food security information and then do IPC-based food security classifications. And so in Guinea, cadre harmonisé workshops had been happening historically because PLEW, which is a regional organization that does a lot of food security work, they tend to work more in a lot of the Francophone countries. And so because of that, they were already doing cadre harmonisé workshops in Guinea, but they weren't in Sierra Leone and Liberia. And so given the Ebola outbreak, PLEW's decided to do cadre harmonization analyses, but because of some issues with getting partner organizations into those countries, in particular, SILS was not allowed at that point to send staff to those countries. We had to hold the cadre harmonization workshop in Dakar. And instead of, in a typical workshop, we have a lot of national staff that come and participate and bring information. And by doing it in Dakar, that limited a lot of local participation that would normally happen in a cadre harmonization workshop. And then moving forward 2 more months, WFP frequently in emergency situations do quantitative representative food security assessments. And, but in the cases of Ebola, Liberia, and Sierra Leone, there had been some concerns about doing on-the-ground food security assessments during the Ebola outbreak, because if then Ebola were to spread to those areas afterwards, WFP and some of the UN organizations were concerned that they could be blamed for that spread. And so they waited until after the peak of the Ebola crisis to do EFTA food security assessments in all 3 countries. And so it wasn't until April to June 2015, which is roughly a year after the peak of the Ebola outbreak, that we were finally able to get some representative food security data on all 3 countries. And then looking forward to the end of 2015, this is now after most of the Ebola impacts are over in all 3 countries, but due to the Ebola crisis, it became clear that there were a lot of gaps in the early warning systems in Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea that FuseNet could help support and build capacity. And so USAID provided FuseNet with funding to open local offices in all 3 countries with a primary focus on building knowledge-based products and supporting local and national food security early warning systems, so they would be prepared for crises like this in the future should they occur. Just to kind of go over various activities that happened, I kind of mentioned them earlier, but there were a lot of different information gaps, particularly related to market functioning, trade flows, crop production levels, particularly in late 2014 at the peak of the Ebola crisis. And FuseNet, as well as other organizations, did a variety of different types of monitoring, but as I mentioned earlier, they were quite limited due to difficulties with getting staff on the ground, as well as because these countries were not countries that typically had acute food security issues, there just wasn't some of the local capacity that you would frequently see in Ethiopia or Niger or another country that would have more frequent acute food security problems. And then I just wanted to go give a little more detail about some of our SMS-based trader surveys that we did. That the reason why we decided to do trader surveys was because WFP was doing MBAM surveys already and collecting a lot of the food security data. And we didn't want to replicate efforts, and we had these significant concerns about market implications. And so we basically did trader surveys. At the beginning, it was every 2 weeks, and then it got extended to, I think it was every month, for both Sierra Leone and Liberia, getting information about whether markets were open, supply, demand, things of that sort. And so one of the lessons learned that I'll get later is they definitely revealed some issues with SMS-based trader surveys that was useful at the time, but it definitely provided some information and food for thought about how to improve them in the future, which I'll get into in a few minutes. So some challenges and lessons learned. The first challenge that became apparent with the Ebola outbreak is traditionally the food security community hasn't dealt a lot with disease outbreaks, that they really, drought, conflict, high, price shocks, things of that sort, are more traditional issues that drive food insecurity in a lot of the countries that FuseNet works. And so we did not have set up at the beginning of the Ebola outbreak a clear communication path with some of the public health organizations that were working on the Ebola outbreak and coming up with projections for potential Ebola caseloads looking forward. And so while we were able to develop some of those connections and we're able to come up with a planning figure based off of projections from communications we had, I think that additional communications between the public health community and the food security community about what the public health community was doing in those three countries, as well as what planning figures they were using in some of their own activities, would have been helpful for further developing some of these planning figures and then adjusting them as new information became available. There were also, as I kind of alluded to earlier, a lot of issues relating to coordination and data sharing. Because these countries didn't have acute food security problems in the past, there just wasn't a lot of those systems already in place. And so FuseNet tried to fill, to a certain degree, that gap by organizing like the Ebola working group and doing some other activities, but there just wasn't really that system in place. And so I think one takeaway that we have would be that should similar crises happen in the future, that I think some contingency planning when some of those earlier caseloads were seen would have been helpful to think through, if this were to get worse, what organizations would we deal with? Who would be the best placed organization to coordinate information sharing and data, things of that sort. So should it have gotten worse, which it did in this case, we would have been more prepared and more ready to hit the ground running. There were also, as I mentioned, with WFP as well as with some other organizations, a lot of issues relating to getting people on the ground as well as doing food security data collection, given some of the Ebola-related fears, particularly in worst affected areas such as KwaZulu and Sierra Leone, Lofa County and Liberia, which really limited our ability for several months to really say what was going on with food security outcomes. Finally, cadre harmonization and IPC workshops always have a lot of data issues and often have logistical challenges, but given that both Sierra Leone and Liberia, it was the first time that we were doing these analyses, and these countries, frequently when there's IPC or cadre harmonization analyses every 6 months, there's efforts made to collect the kind of data that's needed to do these types of workshops. And so there were a lot of limitations because that data hadn't been collected. Also, given that the cadre harmonization workshops weren't actually being held in country and instead were being held remotely, I think limited local knowledge and limited data sharing that could have been better run had these workshops actually been held in country. Also, I think that for SMS-based trader surveys, this was the first time that FuseNet had ever really used SMS-based surveys to do on-the-ground, timely food security monitoring. And then for WFP, I could be wrong. I know they had done some SMS-based trader survey or SMS-based NVAM surveys in the DRC, but this was still one of the first countries that they had been doing on this. And so I think for both organizations, this was somewhat of a learning process. And while I think both surveys provided a fair amount of useful information, I think that it became clear that there were also a lot of limitations relating to survey bias because, for example, you're surveying households that have cell phones, and so those tend to be better off households, and perhaps in more literate households than other people within the countries. And there's just a variety of different bias issues. And so I think that for FuseNet, we're interested in doing SMS-based monitoring in the future, but I think we're still trying to figure out what some of the solutions are to some of the survey biases that we saw in this effort. And so I think it brought up a lot of good challenges there to think about for future monitoring efforts. And then finally, I just wanted to briefly go over what some next steps are for FuseNet in all three countries. as I mentioned earlier, we didn't open local offices until mostly after the Ebola crisis was over. But the Ebola crisis really showed that there were a lot of gaps in the local early warning systems that FuseNet could fill. And so we opened offices with the main purposes of, one, doing regular monitoring similar to other countries, but primarily to build the knowledge base of livelihoods information, of markets information, to be prepared for future crises, as well as to work with local food security networks within the countries to develop them so they can do better food security analyses and then also be prepared. Okay, so on routine monitoring, I'm not going to go too far into this. This is just basically what we do in all of our presence countries. We do regular food security outlook reports. We do rapid assessments, work with partners, things of that sort. Sorry. Okay. This is really the reason why FuseNet opened offices in these countries, is to really work on the network development. And so we've already done a rapid state of the network assessment to get a sense of what the current early warning systems look like in those countries and what some of the gaps are. And then over the coming year, we're planning on doing a variety of other activities, looking at what early warning tools and systems are already in place and figuring out how we can possibly improve them, training key partners on FuseNet's scenario development approach to project food security outcomes into the future, as well as provide some market and price projection training to key partners so those systems can be in place. That currently in the countries there are a variety of levels of price data collection being ongoing in those countries, but there are some issues and gaps in information, and so we're going to work on supporting that. And then, finally, we're going to be doing a couple of special activities. One, a lot of the livelihoods information that are available in countries that have a lot more acute food security problems were not available for these countries, which led to a fair amount of challenges on figuring out what would be the potential food security impacts of Ebola. And so we're going to be working on updating a lot of the livelihoods descriptions and doing in-seasonal calendars for all three countries. We're also, for these countries, although they don't have a lot of acute food insecurity, they do have a fair amount of chronic food security problems. And so an interest of USAID was to get more information about these chronic food security issues. And so we'll be using an IPC chronic approach to do a food security analysis, a chronic food security analysis in Liberia over the coming year with partners. And then finally, we'll also be doing a special study looking back on what some of the impacts of the Ebola outbreak are on food security and livelihoods. That before, as I mentioned earlier, before the crisis, there really had not been a similar crisis where a disease outbreak could potentially lead to food security problems. And so in case there's outbreaks like this in the future, having a better understanding of what potential food security impacts would be quite helpful. And that wraps up my presentation, and I would definitely be very open to any questions people have or thoughts or what your organizations did during the Ebola outbreak. So.
Thank you so much, Brenda. I think we'll go now. Any questions or thoughts you'd like to share from your own experiences on the ground?
I have a question.
Other questions?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the nature of your work, FuseNet, generally is transparency and availability of information.
Yeah.
And so during this, obviously, not public health crisis, I guess my first question is, how often does the need or potential desire weighing of consequences in terms of limiting of information or the maybe lowering of numbers? How does that usually play into your discussions, or if not, did it in this case, or how did you balance, given the government organization and you're dealing with international partners and there's other things, how did you guys manage that?
Yeah, I think that in this case, because we didn't have local staff on the ground and we weren't doing a lot of primary data collection, or in some countries we do have like market enumerators that are collecting price data and things of that sort, which we get a lot of requests for information on. But in these countries, because we didn't have a local presence, that set of primary data wasn't really available on our end. Right. And so I think the issues of sharing that data, which we would always do if we've collected it as a USAID-funded project, didn't really come up in this case beyond some of the SMS-based trader surveys, which if any organization were to ask us for that information, we gave it to them. And so there wasn't any major issues there. I would say with the caseload estimates that became a bit complicated because some of the estimates being done by the CDC weren't actually publicly available. And so while we could have informal conversations with them or with some of these other organizations that were doing projections, there wasn't a documented, published report that had a lot of that information. So I think that led to some issues and some concerns by other organizations about where exactly we were coming up with the numbers that we were providing. Yeah. And so that became somewhat of an issue. I think we tried to handle it the best we could. I don't know if, looking back, if we could have handled it differently. I think we definitely, from the start, were very clear at that point that those planning figures were not a most likely scenario like we do in most of our countries. I know I can't tell you how many briefings where before I got up and did the briefing, someone from senior management from PLEW would get up and basically say, this is not a most likely scenario. This is just a scenario based off of estimates that other organizations were providing on needs or on caseload estimates. And so there were a lot of issues there on those caseload numbers and a lot of controversy about whether or not we should have been giving those numbers. But without a specific number of a potential caseload, it's really difficult to do any type of projections for future food security outcomes, because if you had 20,000 cases versus 250,000 cases, the market impacts, the livelihoods impacts would be very different. And so we felt that even if it was difficult to say, even if it was difficult to come up with a specific number, we felt that it was really needed and very important to be able to then project future food security outcomes. And so even though I know we definitely FuseNet got some heat at the time about coming up with those numbers. So, right. Yeah.
Yeah. If I remember your slide on SMS-based surveys, it was for Liberia and
Sierra Leone.
So can I just ask, how was the strategy, or how did you try to get that information from Guinea? I know that USAID did fund a market-based cash recovery response there. Yeah. So I was just kind of curious.
The reason why we didn't do SMS-based trader surveys in Guinea wasn't because we weren't interested. It was that basically we were using GeoPoll to do those SMS-based trader surveys, and they could do text-based trader surveys in Sierra Leone and Liberia, but they could only do voiceover surveys in Guinea. And I don't remember the price offhand, but I think it was maybe like 5 times more expensive to do voiceover surveys. And so because of that, and because we only kind of had a limited budget at the point that we were starting, and this was the first time we'd ever done surveys like this, we decided to go with the cheaper option, which was Sierra Leone and Liberia. I've heard since then, I think they do have the capacity to do SMS-based surveys in Guinea now, and so you more probably could do better data collection now, but there wasn't any real decision that Guinea was less important. It was just mostly from a budget standpoint.
Nice.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's very interesting to learn more about your organization and what you do. I'm wondering, in terms of your network, do you ever use any of the crisis mappers or some of the open source platforms like Ushahidi?
Yeah, we use them to a certain extent. I wouldn't say in this case that was a main source of information. I know that there were some organizations doing work there, and I looked at them from time to time, but I don't think they were exactly in the format that would be very useful for what we were doing at that point. And so in the case of these three countries, it wasn't the main source of information, although I do know that they existed, and yeah, we looked at them, but it just wasn't we were primarily using.
Any questions online, Ministry?
No,
Not
fine.
yet. Okay. Other questions in the room for Brenda? I think we have just a couple of minutes left.
So I have I'll hog all the questions. I just have a follow-up question on your SMS survey data collection. So you said previously that you didn't do, historically you don't do much data collection yourselves, and that the fact that this was a first time was, one of the challenges you faced. Are you guys planning on continuing to do surveys so that in these situations you're better?
Yeah. So for SMS, we definitely, from time to time, we do on-the-ground surveys. It's just not what we frequently do because of budgetary issues, that we just don't have the kind of funding to do large-scale surveys. But for example, like South Sudan, we've done some smart surveys. We have, from time to time, done on-the-ground food security assessments. It's just most of the time, if there's other organizations like WFP who have more funding to do those kinds of surveys, we tend to support their activities rather than doing our own. For SMS-based surveys in particular, we have had some conversations about doing other type of SMS-based surveys, but when we've looked into it, we haven't quite figured out to date how to adjust for some of the biases from the fact that we really are hitting better off households, and generally for fuse and food security analyses, we focus on the poor who probably would have less good cell phone access. And so because of that, we haven't come up with a very good solution to that issue yet, which has kind of limited our work in that area. That said, we are in conversations. We've had conversations with WFP on their MVAM surveys. We're still having some ongoing conversations about how they're adjusting for biases in their surveys. And we're looking into the issue, and so I don't think it's something that we've completely taken off the table, because it is really useful to be able to get information remotely like that, but I think we just haven't quite figured out some of the sampling issues and how what you can exactly say with that data. And so, for example, with like the MVAM data, I know that they were collecting food security indicators with the MVAM in April, May, and then in all three countries, and then they were also doing on-the-ground surveys. And if you compared some of the indicators, they didn't quite match. And so trying to figure out what some of the biases were that led to those differences is something, we just haven't fully figured out yet.
Thank you so much for, I think we're at 10 o'clock on the dot. We are. So thank you so much for your questions. If other questions come up, Brenda has generously offered her email address here, or you can feel free to get in contact with Missy or myself, and we'll forward your inquiries on to Brenda. But thank you again very much, Brenda, for taking the time to share the struggles and sort of the ways in which you tried to make some